The first time they humiliated him, the room was full of chandeliers that it was 1936, and the ballroom at the Imperial Crown Hotel shimmered like a jewel box set against a city that refused to acknowledge the people who built it. White-gloved waiters floated between linen-draped tables, crystal glasses caught golden light, and a string quartet played Cole Porter with a delicacy that suggested the world was orderly, refined, civilized. But civilization, as Elias Beaumont would learn that night, is often nothing more than a well-dressed performance. Elias stood near the back of the ballroom, in a tailored tuxedo he could barely afford, shoulders squared not with arrogance but with discipline. He had earned his invitation. After 12 years working as an accountant for a shipping company that quietly depended on his brilliance, while publicly pretending he did not exist, he had been asked to attend the annual Investors' Gala. It was progress, they told him. A gesture. A signal that times were changing. He believed them. The city outside the hotel was still struggling through the lingering ache of the Great Depression. Breadlines had shortened, but pride remained thin. In certain neighborhoods, the ache was sharper, more persistent. But inside the ballroom, laughter rang bright and careless. Deals were whispered over champagne. Cigars glowed like embers of entitlement. The men who shaped the city stood beneath chandeliers and congratulated one another for surviving hardship that others had absorbed for them. Elias did not drink, he observed. He carried himself with quiet composure, his dark eyes taking in the architecture, the posture of men who had never been told no, the subtle glances that flickered toward him before quickly retreating. He had grown used to those glances. They did not wound him anymore. They informed him that at precisely 9:30, as dessert plates were cleared, the chairman of the shipping company took the stage to thunderous applause. Augustus Caldwell was a tall man with silver hair and the smooth confidence of someone who had never questioned whether doors would open for him. He spoke of resilience, of vision, of the American spirit. And then he spoke of numbers. Our success, Caldwell declared, lifting a glass, is due to our extraordinary financial stewardship. This year's turnaround, gentlemen, would not have been possible without innovative recalibration in our asset structures. A murmur of approval moved through the room. Elias knew what that meant. He had recalibrated those structures. He had found inefficiencies others overlooked. He had negotiated risk quietly, preserving jobs during a season when layoffs would have been applauded as decisive leadership. Caldwell continued, "Our financial department has worked tirelessly." There was a pause. Elias allowed himself the smallest breath of anticipation. Caldwell smiled thinly. Under the direction of Mr. Harold Whitmore. Harold Whitmore, who had entered the company 3 years prior with a handshake from Caldwell and a resume polished by the right schools and the right clubs, rose modestly as applause swelled. Elias felt something in his chest tighten, not anger, not yet, but recognition. He understood what was happening. Whitmore had signed the reports. Whitmore had presented Elias's analyses as his own. Whitmore had, in private, thanked Elias for support. And now Whitmore was receiving public credit for work that had required Elias's sleepless nights and relentless precision. The applause did not last long enough to mask what came next. Caldwell gestured toward Elias with an indulgent smile. And of course, assistance from some of our dedicated staff. The word assistance landed like a dismissal. A few heads turned. Not many. Elias did not move. He did not flinch. He did not betray the sting. Whitmore sat down, cheeks flushed with triumph. Caldwell raised his glass again, and the quartet resumed its delicate melody. The humiliation was not loud. It was subtle, polite, sanitized, and it was complete. After the gala, Elias walked home instead of accepting the offer of a carriage. The city air was sharp with October chill, and each step against the pavement steadied him. He had known the world would not reward him fairly. What unsettled him was not the theft of recognition, but the expectation that he would accept it silently. At a small brownstone on West 137th Street, his younger sister Clara waited by the window. She had been a schoolteacher before budget cuts eliminated her position. She now tutored neighborhood children for free, believing education was the only currency that could not be stolen. "You're late," she said gently as he entered. "The speeches were long," Elias replied, removing his coat. She studied his face. "And," he paused. He could have told her everything. He could have described the applause, the deliberate omission, the careful phrasing that reduced him to an afterthought. But Clara already understood the world they inhabited. "They are not ready," he said simply. Clara's jaw tightened. "Will they ever be?" Elias moved toward the small wooden desk near the window, where stacks of ledgers and notes were arranged in meticulous order. He ran a hand over the surface, grounding himself. "They don't have to be," he answered. That night, instead of surrendering to bitterness, Elias opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, he wrote a single sentence. "If they refuse to acknowledge your worth, build a world that cannot ignore it." He did not yet know how he would do it. He only knew he would. Over the following months, subtle shifts began to occur. Elias continued his work at the shipping company with the same excellence as before. He did not confront Whitmore. He did not demand recognition. Instead, he began quietly advising local business owners and Harlem shopkeepers struggling with unfair credit terms, restaurateurs navigating predatory suppliers, church leaders seeking ways to stretch dwindling donations. He asked for nothing in return. Word traveled cautiously at first, then steadily. A tailor avoided bankruptcy after Elias renegotiated his lease. A grocer expanded after Elias identified a pricing strategy that undercut exploitative middlemen. A jazz club stabilized its payroll through restructuring he designed. At his kitchen table, he did not advertise his involvement. He believed dignity was not something to display, but to cultivate. Meanwhile, at the shipping company, cracks began to show. Whitmore's projections, unsupported by Elias's quiet corrections, faltered. Risk models grew sloppy. Caldwell, insulated by pride, did not immediately notice. One winter morning, an error in Whitmore's reporting nearly cost the company a contract with a major Atlantic trade partner. Panic spread through the executive floor. Caldwell summoned Whitmore, who in turn summoned Elias. The office was thick with tension when Elias entered. Whitmore gestured toward a stack of papers. "We need to adjust these figures, immediately." Elias reviewed the documents calmly. The mistake was obvious to him, an overestimation of freight stabilization that ignored seasonal port congestion. "You signed these projections," Elias said evenly. Whitmore shifted. "Yes, but you removed the contingency models," Elias continued. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "Can it be fixed?" Elias met his gaze without defiance. "Yes." "How long?" 2 hours. Caldwell glanced at Whitmore, whose confidence had evaporated. "Then fix it." Elias did. He corrected the projections, reinstated the safeguards Whitmore had dismissed, and delivered a revised report before noon. The contract was saved. Crisis dissolved. Caldwell did not apologize for the gala. He did not publicly revise the narrative of success. But something in his posture shifted. Something in the way he regarded Elias changed. Not warmth, not equality, but awareness. Elias noticed. He understood that influence was not seized through confrontation alone. Sometimes it was established through indispensability. Still, the injustice lingered, not only for himself, but for countless others whose contributions were absorbed and erased. The humiliation at the ballroom had not been an isolated event. It was a pattern, and patterns Elias knew could be broken. Spring arrived with restless energy. Harlem pulsed with music and possibility. Yet beneath the rhythm lay structural inequities that threatened to suffocate growth. Banks denied loans to capable entrepreneurs. Insurance premiums soared mysteriously for businesses on certain blocks. Enforcement inspections targeted some establishments while ignoring others. Elias saw the architecture of bias clearly. He had studied systems his entire life. Systems could be restructured. One evening, Clara returned home with a folded notice in her hand. The building that housed her informal tutoring sessions was being sold. The new owner intended to convert it into storage space. They said it isn't profitable to educate children who cannot pay, she said quietly. Elias unfolded the notice. He read it twice. His jaw did not tighten. His breathing did not change. But something resolute crystallized within him. The world had told him to accept partial credit, to remain grateful for proximity to power, to swallow humiliation with grace. He had done so long enough. That night, as jazz drifted faintly from a nearby club, Elias opened his notebook again. Beneath his original sentence, he wrote another. Dignity requires infrastructure. He began drafting plans, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but for construction. A cooperative credit union. A shared investment pool among local business owners. Educational spaces funded collectively, rather than dependent on approval from dismissive institutions. It would require trust. Discipline. Patience. It would also require confronting resistance, not with raised fists, but with unshakable resolve. The patience. It would also require confronting resistance, not with raised fists, but with unshakable resolve. Night. The music stopped at the Imperial Crown had not broken Elias Beaumont. It had clarified him, and as the city prepared for another summer, unaware of the quiet revolution forming in a modest brownstone on 137th Street, Elias sharpened his pencil, straightened his posture, and began building a future no chandelier could dim. By the summer of 1937, the air in Harlem carried two kinds of heat. One rose from the pavement, shimmering against brick and steel as children darted through open hydrants, and musicians leaned into brass solos that echoed down the avenues. The other heat was quieter, harder to see. It pressed against storefront windows and lingered in the pauses between handshakes. It was the heat of pressure, economic, political, deliberate. Elias Beaumont had anticipated resistance when he began organizing the cooperative credit union. He had expected skepticism from neighbors who had been promised opportunity before and handed disappointment instead. What he had not fully anticipated was how swiftly the established powers would notice. The credit union started modestly, in the back room of a barber shop on Lenox Avenue, folding chairs, a chalkboard, a metal lockbox, 10 members at first, shopkeepers, a pharmacist, a seamstress who had been turned down for a small business loan 3 times despite immaculate records. They pooled small contributions weekly. Elias handled the ledgers, every column precise, every transaction transparent. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, only discipline. Within 4 months, the cooperative had stabilized 3 businesses that had been on the brink of closure. Within 6 months, it had extended its first education grant to reopen Clara's tutoring program in a modest rented storefront, complete with fresh paint and second-hand desks. Children returned to lessons, parents exhaled. The ripple was subtle but unmistakable. Success, however, is rarely ignored by those invested in dependence. It began with inspections. City compliance officers, clipboards tucked beneath their arms, began appearing at cooperative member locations with unusual frequency. They measured signage, they examined floorboards, they cited obscure codes that had never been enforced with such vigor in other neighborhoods. Fines followed, small enough not to cause immediate collapse, but consistent enough to erode confidence. Elias noticed the pattern within weeks. He spread out the violation notices across his kitchen table one evening while Clara prepared tea. Each citation bore a different official signature, Yet the language was eerily similar. It was not random. It was coordinated. "They want you distracted," Clara said softly, setting a cup beside him. "They want us dependent," Elias corrected, scanning the dates. He did not react with anger. Anger clouded precision. Instead, he began cataloging every inspection, every fine, every inconsistency. He cross-referenced them with violations, or lack thereof, at comparable establishments downtown. The disparity was measurable, but documentation alone would not stop the pressure. At the shipping company, tension had also begun to shift. Harold Whitmer's earlier miscalculations had not gone unnoticed among investors. While Caldwell still maintained public loyalty, the board had quietly begun requesting detailed briefings Whitmore increasingly relied on Elias to prepare. One late afternoon, as sunlight slanted across the executive floor, Caldwell summoned Elias alone. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and cigar smoke. Caldwell stood at the window, gazing toward the harbor where cargo ships drifted like patient giants. "You've been busy outside of work," Caldwell said without turning. Elias did not feign ignorance. "I volunteer in my community." Caldwell pivoted slowly, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You're organizing capital." "Yes, for businesses that are not traditionally supported." "They are traditionally underserved," Elias replied evenly. Caldwell's lips pressed thin. "There are concerns. From whom?" "From men who believe stability depends on established channels." Elias met his gaze. "Stability for whom?" The question lingered. Caldwell approached his desk and leaned forward, palms resting against polished mahogany. "Beaumont, you are valuable here. Do not jeopardize that by aligning yourself with movements." Elias did not raise his voice. "Ensuring that families can sustain themselves is not a movement. It is maintenance." Caldwell's eyes flickered with restrained irritation. "You are an employee and a citizen." Silence thickened the room. Caldwell straightened. "Be careful." It was not advice. It was warning. Elias left the office with his posture unchanged. He understood the message clearly. Continue building, but expect consequence. The consequence arrived sooner than anticipated. On a humid Thursday evening, as cooperative members gathered for their quarterly meeting, a uniformed officer entered Clara's tutoring storefront without knocking. He scanned the room of children bent over arithmetic problems and cleared his throat sharply. "This establishment lacks proper assembly permits," he announced. Clara approached calmly. "We have filed all required paperwork." "Processing delays," he replied dismissively. "You must vacate until further notice." The children's pencils stilled. Elias rose from his seat at the back of the room and walked forward with measured steps. He did not confront the officer with hostility. He did not argue loudly. He simply asked, "May I see the documentation authorizing closure?" The officer hesitated, then produced a typed notice. Elias examined it carefully. The permit cited applied to commercial entertainment venues exceeding 50 occupants. There were 23 children present. "This classification is incorrect," Elias said quietly. The officer's jaw tightened. "I enforce what is written." "And I will appeal what is misapplied," Elias replied. The officer surveyed the room, perhaps expecting defiance or outrage. Instead, he encountered composure, parents standing tall, children watching silently. Clara's chin lifted. He folded the notice stiffly. "You have 48 hours. When he left, the room exhaled collectively. One of the fathers spoke first. "They're trying to shut us down." "Yes," Elias said simply. "What do we do?" Elias looked around the room, at fear masked as anger, at resilience struggling not to fracture. He chose his words carefully. "We comply with the law. We challenge the misapplication of it. And we do not abandon each other." There was no dramatic vow, no rallying cry. Only resolved. Over the next 2 days, Elias worked without sleep. He drafted a formal appeal citing municipal codes with meticulous clarity. He attached records of timely permit filings, occupancy logs, and comparative data from similar institutions that had not been cited. He requested a hearing. Simultaneously, he did something more strategic. He reached out to a journalist he had quietly assisted months earlier with financial clarifications regarding discriminatory lending patterns. The journalist, a young woman named Margaret Doyle with a reputation for precision and integrity, had been searching for a story that revealed systemic imbalance without sensationalism. Elias did not dramatize the situation. He presented facts, patterns, documentation. Margaret listened. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at City Hall. Word spread cautiously through Harlem. The cooperative members arrived in their best attire, not as protesters, but as citizens. Inside the chamber, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A panel of municipal officials shuffled papers with bureaucratic detachment. The officer who had issued the closure notice sat rigidly to one side. Elias stepped forward when called. He wore a simple dark suit, his expression composed. He did not accuse. He did not lecture. He laid out evidence. He walked the panel through each code citation, each discrepancy, each pattern of enforcement that disproportionately targeted cooperative members, while overlooking comparable violations elsewhere. He spoke evenly, without embellishment. The chamber grew quiet. One official adjusted his glasses. "Are you suggesting bias?" "I am presenting data," Elias replied. Margaret Doyle sat near the back, pen moving swiftly. When Elias finished, he closed his folder gently. "We are not asking for special treatment, only consistent application of the law." There was no applause, no dramatic declaration, but something shifted. The panel recessed for deliberation. Minutes stretched. Parents held hands. Clara's gaze remained fixed forward. When the officials returned, the lead commissioner cleared his throat. "The closure notice is rescinded pending proper review of enforcement protocols." A murmur rippled through the chamber. It was not a triumphant roar. It was relief. Outside City Hall, Margaret approached Elias. "You knew they would listen." "I knew they would have to," he replied. Her article ran 2 days later under the headline, "Uneven Scales, a closer look at municipal enforcement patterns." It did not name villains, it named discrepancies. It did not inflame, it illuminated. The response was immediate. Other neighborhoods began reviewing their own citations. Questions surfaced in council meetings. Caldwell received inquiries from investors about his employees' involvement in civic matters. Pressure intensified. That Friday afternoon, Caldwell summoned Elias again. This time the board chairman was not alone. 2 senior investors sat stiffly in leather chairs. "You have drawn attention," Caldwell began. Elias remained standing. "Attention to documented inconsistencies." One investor spoke sharply. "Your extracurricular activities risk associating this company with controversy." "I have not mentioned the company," Elias said calmly. "You don't need to," the investor retorted. "Your name is attached." Caldwell interjected, voice measured but strained. "We are prepared to offer you a promotion, Beaumont, increased salary, expanded responsibilities." Elias listened without visible reaction. "On the condition," Caldwell continued carefully, "that you scale back your community organizing." There it was. The room held its breath. For a moment, Elias felt the weight of the offer: financial security, formal recognition, the acknowledgement he had been denied at the gala. It was everything he had once believed would validate his worth, but validation extracted at the cost of silence was merely another form of erasure. He spoke softly. "Respectfully, I cannot." The investors exchanged incredulous glances. "You are declining advancement?" One asked. I am declining conditions that require me to neglect responsibility. To whom? Caldwell demanded. To those who have none of these chairs. Elias answered. Silence deepened. Caldwell's expression hardened, not with rage, but with calculation. Then perhaps your future here is limited. Elias inclined his head slightly. Then I will build elsewhere. He left the office without haste. Word of his resignation spread through Harlem like a tremor. Some feared he had overreached. Others saw it as liberation. That evening, the cooperative gathered again in the barber shop. The room was crowded beyond capacity. They think if they remove you. This ends, one member said. Elias shook his head gently. It was never about me. He placed a stack of new documents on the table. What is this? Clara asked. Articles of incorporation, he replied. For a community development trust. Legally structured, transparent, independent. The room fell still. He continued, we will formalize our structure. We will invite oversight. We will operate with standards so clear they cannot be questioned, and we will expand. The magnitude of what he was proposing settled slowly. It was no longer survival. It was transformation. Outside, night draped Harlem in velvet shadows. Jazz drifted again through open windows. The city that had once reduced Elias Beaumont to assistance was about to discover the cost of underestimating a man who never needed to raise his voice. The injustice had escalated. So had he. And somewhere in a boardroom overlooking the harbor, Augustus Caldwell stared at the skyline and realized that power built on exclusion was beginning to tremble, not because of noise, but because of a quiet, relentless man who understood that dignity, once organized, is unstoppable. By autumn of 1938, the Beaumont Community Development Trust was no longer an idea whispered in back rooms. It had become a structure: brick, ink, signatures, law. What began as folding chairs in a barber shop now occupied 2 renovated storefronts on 138th Street, one for financial services, one for education and business advisement. The paint was modest, the signage restrained, but the presence was undeniable, and that was precisely the problem. Growth, when it emerges from the margins, unsettles those accustomed to defining the center. The trust had done something few believed possible. It had secured a legitimate charter through meticulous legal navigation, ensured compliance beyond minimum requirements, and built alliances with churches, veteran associations, and women-led civic groups across Harlem. Contributions increased. Loan approvals expanded. A small manufacturing cooperative opened 3 blocks away, employing 14 men who had previously been turned away from union positions under vague pretexts. For the first time in years, hope was not abstract. It was structured. Elias Beaumont had not sought leadership for admiration, but leadership had found him regardless. He did not posture. He did not deliver theatrical speeches. He spent his days reviewing ledgers, meeting shopkeepers, advising young entrepreneurs, and mentoring students who lingered after Clara's tutoring sessions with questions about numbers and power. He taught them something radical: that systems could be understood, and systems understood could be reshaped. But while Harlem organized, other forces reorganized in response. It began quietly, as opposition always does when it wishes to appear accidental. A key supplier for several trust-supported businesses abruptly terminated contracts, citing internal restructuring. A printing press that had agreed to produce educational materials rescinded its offer after unforeseen capacity constraints. A promising land purchase for a community warehouse fell through when financing evaporated overnight. Patterns again. Elias did not panic. He documented. He noticed something else. The pressure was no longer limited to inspections or bureaucratic interference. It was financial containment. Invisible hands tightening credit channels beyond Harlem's borders. One evening, Margaret Doyle visited the trust office after closing hours. The street outside was lit by amber lamps and softened by a faint October mist. "You've stepped on someone's interests," she said without preamble. Elias looked up from a ledger. "That was inevitable." Margaret removed her gloves slowly. "I've been hearing your name in rooms where it wasn't spoken before." "Which rooms?" "Banking circles, shipping investors, even city council donors." Elias considered this carefully. "And what are they saying?" "That you're destabilizing the natural order." He almost smiled. "The natural order required children to study by candlelight." Margaret's expression softened, then sharpened. "Again, be careful. There are men who prefer quiet suffocation to visible injustice." "I have no intention of suffocating," Elias replied. She hesitated. "You've also made an enemy you may not have anticipated." "Who?" "Harold Whitmore." Elias paused. Whitmore had not vanished after Elias resigned from the shipping company. On the contrary, he had ascended. With Beaumont gone, he consolidated authority within the financial department. Caldwell, facing investor scrutiny and eager to maintain confidence, had promoted Whitmore publicly as the architect of continued stability. But stability had begun to wobble. Whitmore's projections lacked the silent corrections Elias once provided. Risk margins were misjudged. Shipping routes were expanded without sufficient contingency. And when the trust began redirecting certain cargo partnerships toward independent distributors aligned with Harlem businesses, Whitmore noticed, not because of principle, because of profit. "He believes you are siphoning opportunity." Margaret continued. "I am creating it," Elias said. To him, that's the same thing. The warning hung between them. 2 weeks later, the first blow landed on a crisp November evening. As families gathered in storefront windows to watch the early snowfall drift like ash from the sky, the lights in the Beaumont Trust building flickered. Once, twice, and then died. The entire block followed. Children's laughter from Clara's classroom dissolved into murmurs. Shopkeepers stepped into the street. Street lamps darkened. A transformer failure, the electric company would later claim. But only one block lost power. Only one. Candles were lit quickly. Elias moved through the darkness without haste, reassuring members that this was temporary. The trust had contingency reserves. Operations would resume. Yet something about the blackout felt intentional. The next morning, inspectors arrived again, this time citing unsafe working conditions due to inadequate lighting compliance. Elias stood on the sidewalk as officials affixed a temporary closure notice to the trust's front door. Margaret appeared minutes later, camera slung over her shoulder. This was coordinated. Elias's gaze remained steady. Yes. The officer in charge, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, avoided meeting Elias's stare. "You can't operate without certified electrical integrity," he recited. "The outage originated beyond our internal systems," Elias responded calmly. "That's not my department." "Then we will escalate to one that is." The officer shifted uncomfortably. He had likely enforced dozens of closures before. Few had responded with composure rather than outrage. Clara joined Elias on the sidewalk, her coat wrapped tightly against the cold. "The children are frightened." "They will see how we respond," Elias said softly. By noon, word had spread. Supporters gathered, not in protest, but in presence. They stood along the sidewalks in dignified silence. Shop owners from surrounding blocks brought lanterns. A local pastor began organizing evening tutoring sessions in his church basement. But the pressure intensified. That afternoon, Elias received a formal summons. Allegations of financial irregularities within the trust. It was a lie. And it was strategic. Accusations of mismanagement could fracture community confidence faster than power outages. Clara, read the document twice. "They're trying to discredit you." "Yes. Will it work?" "Only if we are unprepared." He opened a locked cabinet and removed binders, meticulously organized records of every transaction. Every loan, every repayment schedule. Transparency had never been optional for him. It had been foundational. Still, he understood the deeper tactic. If they could not intimidate him directly, they would exhaust him. That night, as snow thickened along rooftops, Elias walked alone through Harlem. Not to escape, but to think. He passed storefronts whose survival now intertwined with the trust. He saw children studying under borrowed lamps. He heard muted conversations behind frosted windows. Fear braided with faith. He did not feel anger. He felt responsibility. The following week, the hearing convened in a larger chamber than before. This was no minor permit appeal. This was reputational warfare. City officials, banking representatives, and observers filled the room. At the far end, seated with polished composure, was Harold Whitmore. Their eyes met briefly. Whitmore inclined his head in a gesture that was almost courteous. The proceedings began with accusations framed as concerns. Discrepancies in loan risk exposure, unconventional funding pools, potential destabilization of traditional financial networks. Elias listened without interruption. When it was his turn, he stood. He did not defend himself emotionally. He presented records, audited statements, repayment histories, independent evaluations conducted by third-party accountants he had secured months earlier precisely for this possibility. He walked the panel through every claim. Each one dissolved under documentation. Murmurs shifted through the chamber. Finally, Whitmore spoke. Even if their books are technically sound, their existence undermines established credit hierarchies. There it was. Not fraud. Not mismanagement. Hierarchy. Elias turned toward him slowly. Established hierarchies, Elias said evenly, have left entire neighborhoods structurally excluded from capital access. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Because risk must be calculated. And who defines risk? Elias asked gently. Silence. He continued. When communities are denied opportunity, they are labeled unstable. When they build their own opportunity, they are labeled disruptive. The common denominator is not risk, it is control. The room still. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse Whitmore personally. He exposed the architecture. A commissioner leaned forward. Are you suggesting systemic bias in capital distribution? I am suggesting, Elias replied calmly, that stability built on exclusion is inherently unstable. It was not a threat. It was a truth. Margaret's pen raced across paper. After hours of examination, the panel recessed. The tension inside the chamber felt heavier than the snowfall outside. When the officials returned, their decision was measured, but decisive. The allegations of financial irregularity were unsubstantiated. The trust would remain operational pending independent infrastructure review of the power outage. Whitmore's composure cracked barely, but visibly. As attendees filtered out, he approached Elias privately. You could have accepted the promotion, Whitmore said in a low voice. You could have operated within the system. I am operating within it, Elias replied. You're challenging it. I am strengthening it. Whitmore's expression hardened. You think you're untouchable because you appear virtuous. Elias met his gaze without hostility. No one is untouchable. Then why persist? Elias considered him for a moment not as an enemy, but as a man shaped by entitlement. Because there are children studying by borrowed light, he said quietly. Whitmore had no answer. 3 nights later, the lights returned to 138th Street. Not flickering. Steady. The official explanation cited grid repair. But word had reached higher offices. Margaret's article, When Order Protects Inequality, had stirred debate beyond Harlem. Investors uneasy about reputational exposure began pressuring city departments to avoid overt suppression. The strategy had backfired. The trust reopened with a modest gathering. No grand celebration. Just open doors. Inside, children resumed lessons. Shopkeepers resumed consultations. Loan applications resumed processing. Elias stood near the window, watching snow melt along the curb. Clara approached. You won. He shook his head gently. We endured. Outside, a small crowd lingered, not cheering, simply present. The night the lights went out had been meant to frighten. Instead, it revealed something unanticipated. Harlem no longer depended on permission, and in offices downtown, where power had once been assumed permanent, unease replaced certainty, because the quiet man who never raised his voice had done something far more dangerous than shout. He had made dignity sustainable. In systems, once exposed to their own imbalance, rarely return unchanged. By the spring of 1939, Harlem no longer whispered the name Beaumont with caution. It spoke it with steadiness. Not because Elias had become a symbol, he resisted that, but because he had become infrastructure. The trust now operated on 3 blocks. A printing cooperative had opened its own modest press. Clara's tutoring center had evolved into a formal academy with volunteer instructors from neighboring boroughs. The children who once studied under borrowed lamps now debated poetry beneath electric chandeliers salvaged from a shuttered theater. But growth has gravity. And gravity draws attention. Downtown investors, who once dismissed Harlem as economically peripheral, now watch the numbers shift with unease. Independent distributors linked to the trust were securing contracts previously monopolized by consolidated shipping interests. Neighborhood-owned warehouses were reducing dependency on external middlemen. A new pattern was forming: capital circulating inward rather than leaking outward. For some, it was innovation. For others, it was insubordination. The decisive moment did not arrive with shouting or sirens. It arrived in an envelope. The letter bore the seal of the Metropolitan Commercial Authority, a consortium of city-aligned financiers and regulatory officials whose quiet influence shaped trade permissions, licensing thresholds, and infrastructure. Access. Elias opened it at his desk beneath the afternoon light. He read it once. Then again. The authority was convening a strategic alignment review. The trust's continued charter, it stated, required harmonization with broader commercial frameworks. Attendance was mandatory. Clara stood across from him, watching his expression. They want to absorb you, she said. Yes, Elias replied, or dissolve you. Yes. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at the Imperial Crown Hotel, the same ballroom where 3 years earlier he had stood beneath chandeliers and listened to his work reduced to assistance. The symmetry was not accidental. News of the summons spread quickly. Cooperative members gathered that evening, voices tense but disciplined. They'll corner you, one shopkeeper warned. They'll offer partnership, another suggested, and conditions. Clara added. Elias listened. What will you do? Margaret Doyle asked from the back of the room, notebook closed for once. Elias folded his hands lightly on the table. I will attend, and I will listen. No dramatic declaration followed. He returned home that night and reopened the same leather-bound notebook where years earlier he had written his first quiet vow. Beneath the previous entries, he added a single line. Integrity must survive negotiation. Thursday arrived with polished skies and crisp air. The Imperial Crown Hotel gleamed exactly as it had the night of his humiliation. Chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble. Waiters moved with silent precision. Inside the ballroom, the Metropolitan Commercial Authority assembled like a tableau of inherited influence. Augustus Caldwell sat near the center. Harold Whitmore occupied a seat slightly behind him, posture straight, eyes guarded. Along the perimeter were banking magnates, insurance directors, and municipal liaisons. Elias entered alone. He wore a dark suit, not extravagant, not diminished. He paused briefly beneath the chandeliers, not in nostalgia, but in recognition. The room quieted. A chair had been placed at the far end of a long table. He took it. The authority's chairman, a thin man with immaculate silver hair named Leonard. Huxley began without preamble. "Mr. Beaumont, your trust has demonstrated commendable organizational discipline." Elias inclined his head slightly. "However," Huxley continued, "its independent capital circulation model presents structural irregularities within established metropolitan commerce." "Irregularities?" Elias asked gently. "Disruptions?" Whitmore interjected. Huxley nodded faintly. "Your model reallocates freight channels, alters supplier dependencies, and encourages cooperative purchasing structures that circumvent traditional brokerage pathways." "Which are lawful," Elias said. "Lawful," Huxley agreed. "But destabilizing." There it was again, stability defined not by equity, but by preservation of hierarchy. Huxley folded his hands. "We propose a merger framework. The trust would operate as a subsidiary advisory division within the Metropolitan Authority. Funding access would increase. Regulatory friction would diminish. In exchange, strategic oversight would align with central commercial standards." Translation. Absorption. Caldwell finally spoke, voice measured. "It is an opportunity, Beaumont." Whitmore's gaze remained fixed. Calculating. Elias did not answer immediately. He allowed silence to stretch, not as defiance, but as contemplation. "And if we decline?" he asked. Huxley's expression remained smooth. "Your charter will be reviewed under revised compliance statutes. Infrastructure support may be reevaluated. Licensing renewals could encounter complications." A chandelier flickered faintly, as though history itself shifted overhead. Elias understood the weight of the moment. Acceptance would guarantee stability, but under supervision that diluted autonomy. Refusal would invite escalation. He looked around the table slowly. He did not see villains. He saw men accustomed to defining limits. "I appreciate the offer," he began quietly. "But the trust was formed precisely because traditional channels did not accommodate the communities it serves." Huxley leaned forward. "And now those channels are extending accommodation." "With conditions," Elias replied. Whitmore's voice cut in, sharper than intended. "Every system requires coordination." "Coordination," Elias said softly, "is not the same as control." The air tightened. Huxley's tone cooled. "Beaumont, you stand at a crossroads. Partnership secures longevity. Independence invites uncertainty." Elias rested his palms lightly on the polished table. "Independence built with transparency does not threaten stability. It strengthens it." "On your terms," Whitmore countered. "On equitable terms," Elias corrected. Caldwell's patience thinned. "You are being idealistic." Elias met his gaze steadily. "I am being consistent," Huxley exhaled. "Very well. If you insist on autonomy, then demonstrate scalability without destabilization." A subtle shift in tone. "Explain," Elias said. "Present a comprehensive integration plan within 30 days, showing how your trust can coexist without redirecting major freight contracts away from metropolitan oversight. In other words, prove your model does not diminish ours. It was a test designed to corner him into compromise. Elias nodded once. "I will present." The meeting adjourned with restrained civility. But beneath it lay a challenge designed to strain capacity. Outside the hotel, Margaret approached immediately. "They're daring you to dilute your impact," she said. "They're daring us to refine it," Elias replied. The next 30 days were relentless. Elias and the Trust's advisory board worked without pause. They analyzed freight distribution patterns, identified non-competitive lanes that could expand overall volume rather than redirect existing contracts, and developed a dual-channel framework allowing independent distributors to operate within metropolitan infrastructure without surrendering ownership. It required brilliance. It required patience. It required refusing ego. Clara coordinated educational outreach to ensure community members understood the stakes. Shopkeepers contributed. Data. Warehouse operators offered insights. For the first time, the trust was not simply defending itself. It was architecting a blueprint for coexistence. On the 29th day, Elias finalized the proposal. He returned to the Imperial Crown Ballroom with a portfolio thicker than the one he had carried years before. The authority reconvened. Huxley began coolly. "We are prepared to review." Elias stood. He walked them through freight models that increased overall shipping volume by incorporating previously neglected routes. He demonstrated how cooperative purchasing reduced price volatility, stabilizing demand across boroughs. He outlined compliance structures exceeding regulatory standards, eliminating the need for oversight intrusion. He spoke for over an hour, calm, precise, unhurried. When he finished, the room was silent. Whitmore flipped through the pages, searching for flaws. Caldwell adjusted his glasses. Huxley leaned back slowly. "This integration plan does not erode metropolitan oversight," Huxley admitted. "It expands it." "By strengthening underserved nodes," Elias replied. Whitmore looked up sharply. "You're leveraging us." Elias's expression did not change. "I am inviting collaboration." The subtle shift was undeniable. The trust was no longer a peripheral entity seeking permission. It was presenting innovation that enhanced the entire commercial ecosystem. Huxley finally spoke. "Your autonomy will be preserved. The authority will adopt elements of your model within broader frameworks." It was not surrender. It was adaptation. Caldwell regarded Elias with something bordering on respect. "You have altered the architecture." Elias shook his head gently. "We adjusted the foundation." As the meeting concluded, Whitmore lingered. "Behind, you could have crushed certain contracts," Whitmore said quietly. "You chose not to." "Destruction is inefficient," Elias replied. Whitmore studied him. "You never retaliated." "I corrected," Elias said. For a moment, Whitmore seemed smaller, not diminished by force, but confronted by contrast. "Why?" he asked finally. Elias considered him carefully. "Because the goal was never to win," he said softly. It was to build something that did not require losing. Whitmore had no answer. Weeks later, the integration model rolled out citywide. Cooperative credit structures expanded beyond Harlem. Independent freight lanes increased metropolitan volume, rather than diverting it. The trust remained autonomous, recognized now not as a threat, but as a catalyst. And on a warm June evening, beneath the very chandeliers that once witnessed his humiliation, the Metropolitan Authority hosted a public forum on economic innovation. Elias was invited to speak. He approached the podium. Without spectacle. He did not recount injustice. He did not revisit humiliation. He spoke instead of responsibility. "Stability," he said, voice steady beneath crystal light, "is strongest when it includes those once excluded. Dignity is not granted by hierarchy. It is sustained by participation." The applause that followed was not thunderous. It was earned. Outside, Harlem pulsed with music once more, but this time, the rhythm carried something deeper than resilience. It carried recognition. Elias Beaumont stepped away from the podium, not triumphant, not vindicated, but fulfilled. He had never raised his voice. He had never needed to, because true power, he had proven, does not shout. It builds, and in building, it changes the room.